hard to kind of try to fold everything back into one conversation about ethical consumption and sort of how we understand that the role of consuming things within our social movements and in making change that is genuine change and development. So I think I also have a presentation that I'm going to give, and I'm going to try to maybe do some summarizing, and then after that, Chen is going to respond. Is that okay? Do you want to respond? I pulled her in as a respondent, just to sort of try to do some synthesis about what's going on in our conversation. But then, of course, we want to open it up to everybody and sort of think about ethical consumption in the Philippine context more broadly. And I'm so sorry because it's been a crazy week, so my voice is going, but it's still around, so for now it's okay.
But before you start, can I mention this one thing?
Yeah.
Our problem is the children. We were uninformed about all these good things happening. For example, this one that you are telling us, we don't know anything about it. That's why even if we push ethical consumption, if there's no way to inform the consumer,
I think it's a broad question. Kasi it's not one strategy.
Right.
Kasi my examples before was in fact it's to change mindset. Definitely education and all that can change mindsets. But if you want it to be popular, we have to figure out creative ways in actually making that happen. And so sometimes, we have to figure out kind of nice ways of promoting ideas, right, in order to change minds. But sometimes we have to kind of really create campaigns where it's not as nice, right? It's not as comfortable. It's not as neat, right? Kasi it can involve a whole bunch of other folks to see a different way. So I think kind of this is really answering the question. It might be different, and we have to explore all of those. We can't say that there's only one way of doing this, because history tells us otherwise. Right? So I think kind of that's kind of where that's my prelude to
I'm not really sure if I'm going to touch on all those issues, but I feel like some of the things, like one of the tensions I feel like Fran did mention is the thing about power and where power sort of lies. When you think about production and consumption, there's a lot of political movements historically that deal with production, fair production. And I think fair consumption's always been there as a political movement, and we've tried to sort of highlight the consumption aspect of it. But there's still this major tension about sort of who holds the power. I mean, it's like we want to give power to the consumer to enact that individual action that can make a change. But at the same time, if we sort of only build a movement that's about voting with your dollar or your peso, we're going to be in trouble because a lot of people won't participate in that because they lack, income poor people who don't have a sort of, I'd like to believe that there's a way that everybody, all kinds of social classes can have a consumption, an ethical consumption. But that means changing practices on the ground. So I feel like what I'm going to do is just tell you a little bit more about TIGRA's work with Permit for Change. And I think, this last one, C, economic paradigm, I think that for TIGRA, we understand ethical consumption as a transitional thing. It's like it's not the end goal to have everyone consuming ethically. It's a way that you can build power in places that need to build power. So I'm going to talk about the ethical consumer, and then I'm going to talk about the solidarity economy, which is our sort of framework. I know that some of you are also familiar with it because there was a social and solidarity economy conference in Manila just maybe 3 weeks ago. So this is our tagline as TIGRA. It's making economic choices matter, sustaining communities across borders. And because we're based in the Philippines and then also in the U.S., founded in the U.S., we have a transnational framework. And TIGRA started really with a boycott. So if you think about the consumer movements that Francis was talking about earlier, some of them are these boycotts, many of them. And so when we think of ethical consumption, there's a whole scale of activities. You know, there is the ethical choice that you make when you go into a store and you buy something, but then there's also the choice that you know, large groups of people, institutions make in order to sort of aggregate this individual agency into a powerful political force, and the boycott is one of them. So we had this boycott around Western Union in 2006, and that was really thinking about sort of Western Union at the time. You know, their profit margins are like 28%. You know, it's higher than like ExxonMobil, and you know, at the time they had very localized philanthropy, basically going back into the area where their headquarters is, which is in Colorado. So there's not very many immigrant communities there. So it's sort of for TIGRA and for a lot of our immigrant sort of allies, that sort of discrepancy between where you make your money and where sort of the profits go back into shareholders or into sort of, you know, very little philanthropy work in non-immigrant communities. I think that was like a point of political sort of, that's a political perspective that we sort of brought into this thinking about remittances, which is not a very political. You know, based on the boycott stuff, a lot of companies approached us, like something like 40, 50 companies. 87 companies, okay, said, look, we want to work with you. And at the same time, some of the immigrant groups in the US that we sort of launched this program with, they said, you know, we'd like to support, but we still send money. I mean, how can we not support our families in our home countries? And so we started to go down the path of the boycott, of trying to support companies that are sort of doing the right thing in the framework of the remittance industry, and sort of recognizing that migration exists and that transnational families exist. So we can't just say, you know, you can't engage in that. We have to try to forge a way forward. So the Remit for Change thing came out, and we have a seal, actually. So in the same sense that fair trade has a seal, we also have a seal. And it stands for fair pricing, a transparency of fees, exchange rates. We have an anti-displacement investment, so companies can't invest in projects that cause displacement. So, you know, when we sign with a company, there's all these non-disclosure agreements, and we look at their books and they look at ours, and it's a really long and difficult process. But then the last one, which is the hardest one, is the community reinvestment. And that it ranges usually from $1 to 1%, goes back into a fund that is designated for community-controlled projects. And in the Philippines, we have 5 partners, and our partners work. Also, these are the companies that support migrant social enterprise. It's a changing list, so not all of them are still there. But these are our 5 organizations that we also support in the Philippines through this project, and all of them are migrant serving organizations. So they help, for example, in the Kabayan, they help you know, OFWs all over the world sort of save and invest their money, oftentimes into rural enterprises, rice mills or agricultural cooperatives. So I feel like as an organization, TIGRA is part of this sort of larger movement about how a remitter in the U.S. where we're based makes a choice that is in solidarity with other social movements happening on the ground, other actions that are supporting the more just and more sustainable economy that we have in our mind. So in terms of our model, I have like 3 things that I feel like are super important in terms of ethical consumption, and for me, ethical consumption is number 2. Because number 1 is that we have some responsibility, that we're holding people accountable to something, that we're not just, you know, passively accepting what is already out there to consume, but that we're actually forging we're impacting what's actually available in terms of the supply of different products and services. So I think this is is the kind of thing that I think hopefully it's beyond our remit for change model, because the remit for change thing is just an example, but I feel like the same is true with fair trade, for example. You can't have fair trade without sort of understanding what's happening at the production level and opposing certain practices. And then there's the ethical consumption, and of course we want to, that means sort of working with individuals and thinking through what fair consumption looks like, and how you sort of take an existing practice like buying coffee, drinking coffee, and you add a new meaning to that. So you can drink coffee and support a farmer, you know? Or, you know, so it's like there's a way to kind of like take the veil off of our consumption practices and add a new meaning to that. And then the third, which I feel like is the part that hopefully has an impact on the supply, again, of what's available in the market, is the idea of, and back to this idea that I mentioned in the beginning about power and how we build power in communities, especially marginalized communities, poor communities. So it's like if we're not actively channeling our spending in such a way that it's supporting people who maybe don't have the power of spending in a political sense, then I think it's going wrong somehow. Because we want to be with the money, we want to be reallocating stuff to people who need it most, to underdeveloped sectors of our economy, or marginalized producers. So in reallocating, for the remit for change, it's about reallocating to these 5 NGOs that we're trying to support. But I think in terms of food, or in terms of anything, there has to be some kind of strategic reallocation that's based on, mapping a development path, or, it's not just that the money comes back into anything. It has to come back into something that we sort of collectively govern and decide what that should be. And I think that's the really difficult part, and that's where, I think that's where it gets difficult, because we leave that responsibility to other people most of the time, like where our money in effect goes. So this is the idea: is that that ethical consumption can be part of this larger sort of movement around creating political, social, economic infrastructures which can alter the landscape ultimately. And so for TIGRA, that means ultimately affecting the landscape upon which families make decisions about migration. But that's for us, because we're a migrant serving organization, and that's sort of our niche. But for other folks, it's like, how does an ethical food movement contribute to like affecting the farmer who produces that food's eating habits? I think these are the things that are somehow the details that matter. So this is, I think, the direction that we're going as TIGRA. And responsible tourism is up there because that's sort of our emerging project, is thinking about how balikbayan spending contributes to responsible tourism. Because for us, we've sort of identified that maybe not all Filipinos have the spending capacity, but balikbayan families do. So we think of this sort of market of the balikbayan as a real and untapped sort of force in pushing forward ethical consumption as a transitional kind of action. So we have this remittance thing that I just talked about. In the U.S., we're starting an immigrant consumer union with all of our newcomers that we meet. So it's really funny. It's like they join a buying club for like, laundry detergent and toilet paper and rice. And it doesn't seem like it's going to add up to much, but I think getting people to sort of collectivize their buying is an interesting way of sort of approaching the ethical consumption. Because it's like, if ethical consumption is that individual act that you make when you see a stamp or a seal of approval, then it's still working on this very individual level. But thinking about a consumer union, thinking about cooperative buying, thinking about institutional buying. Like I just read the proposed social enterprise bill, and in the social enterprise bill in the Philippines, there's actually it says that 10% of government, what's this called when you buy stuff? Purchasing, starts with a C. Anyway, 10% of government purchasing is supposed to be in the social enterprise sector, according to this proposed bill that hasn't passed. So that's interesting. You know, institutional buying is a really, you know, if you think about like in the US, there's a big movement, and also in Canada, in parts of Europe, called Students Against Sweatshops. So that's about students getting their schools, these major institutions across, you know, across the country or whatever, to not buy sweatshop made products, for example. So institutional buying is something that we haven't yet sort of dealt with, but I feel like that's a good place to go. So that's something I like. TIGRA is sort of seeing the balikbayan, or the Filipino communities abroad as a force that could be channeled for ethical consumption in the Philippines. So that's. Sorry. You guys have